Hi everyone, it's Blake with FishBait. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to create a Laserfiche repository. We'll walk through the different options for SQL Server, creating the databases, as well as the configuration wizard in order to create the repository for you. Let's get started. The creation of a Laserfiche repository can be split into two different tasks. The first is preparing your SQL Server, and the second is the creation of the Laserfiche repository. There are a few things to prep when it comes to the SQL Server, so we'll go ahead and walk through those. Preparing your Microsoft SQL Server, it is recommended to create an empty database before actually running the repository creation wizard. You don't have to. You can actually do it through the repository creation wizard and it will create the database for you, but it's recommended to do it beforehand. This gives you more control over the settings of the database within SQL Server, so you can dictate things like how the database will grow, where the logs will be stored, and things like that that you won't be able to set within the creation wizard itself. It's always strongly recommended to have your SQL Server on a different computer than your Laserfiche server. The only exception really comes into play with SQL Express, but even then you will want to make sure that your Laserfiche server has enough resources that SQL Express won't take from it. And that will give you the best performance from your system. One thing to keep in mind is the tempdb database on the SQL Server. That is used for Laserfiche can get really large. So it's important that you have enough free disk space on SQL Server to allow the tempdb to grow accordingly. For most installations, about 10 gigabytes is sufficient, but larger and higher load repositories might have larger tempdb files. So just prepare accordingly, make sure that you have enough room on your server to accommodate. Alright, so with SQL Server, the first thing that we need to think of is permissions. All SQL tables for the database associated with the repository need to be owned by DBO. If a SQL table is not owned by DBO, you'll need to change the owner of the table to DBO first. Next, you'll need to make a decision as to how you want to create your repository database. Are you going to create it through the wizard, or are you going to create it beforehand? Are you going to use a SQL account, or are you going to use a Windows user account in SQL? Depending on which one you choose, there are different ways to go about it. You'll need to specify which account will be used to log in. If you are using the Laserfiche repository creation wizard, and you want to create the database using that wizard, the SQL account that you choose will need to have the DB creator rights in order to create the databases. You can do that in one of two ways. You can do it by creating the DB creator server role, or by adding the user to the local administrators group on the SQL server. Usually adding it to the local administrators group is not preferred. You'll usually want to control that within SQL itself. And as I mentioned before, the preferred way is to actually create the database first. So I will walk through doing that. Here I have SQL Management Studio. And you can see that I have a couple databases already created here. I am logged in as an administrator. You can see my username up here, so I have my administrator account that I'm logged in as. So if I don't want the account that will be running the Laserfiche server service to be able to have the create role to create databases, I could log in as an administrator, create an empty database first, give my Laserfiche server utility account specific permissions for that database, and then when we run the repository creation wizard, it can actually go through and create all the tables, views, stored procedures, etc. that are needed at that time. So in order to do that, I'm going to right click on databases. We will say new database. First, I'm going to give it a name. And then if you needed to, you could then also go through and change where the log files are being stored, or you can leave them as default. All depends on how your system is set up. If we go to options, we can change this to be recovery mode full. In my case, I'm just going to keep it simple since this is a demo machine, but we have access to all of our other settings as well. And if we wanted to use file groups, we're able to set that up here as well. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. If I refresh my database list, we can see that my database is created. If I expand the tables and views, you can see that they're actually empty because, again, I just created a blank database for this purpose. So now if I wanted to, I could come down into security, go to logins. Here's my utility Laserfiche account that my Laserfiche server service will be using. I'm going to go ahead and right click and go to properties. And when this comes up, I can go to user mapping. Here we can see the repository database that I just created. So I can select that, and then from here I can select DB owner. And now the Laserfiche server service account has full rights to the repository database once I click OK. And again, this makes it so that account doesn't have to have the creator role, which could essentially create other databases. So depending on how your security is, you may not want that. So I'll go ahead and leave DB owner selected here. We will click OK. So now I'm going to grant view any definition to the util Laserfiche account. That will make it so it has the correct permissions on the master database to be able to do what we need to. So I'm going to type in grant view any definition to util Laserfiche. And then if you wanted to, at the beginning of this, you could actually enter in use master, so that way it targets the master database. Or in the top left corner here, we can actually select the master database from the drop down of databases. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll go ahead and execute this now. We can see that it's successfully executed. So now when I run the create repository wizard, we can use the existing database that is here, and this user should be able to create the tables, views, stored procedures, etc. that it needs to. So now let's go ahead and go into the Laserfiche administration console. I already have it open. And from here, if we select the server node, we can get a little bit of information about how many repositories were actually allowed. You can see here, I can see my build, I can see the licensing that I have, my company name, serial number, any features that my repositories on this server will have. You can also see the maximum number of repositories that you're allowed to have. In my case, I'm allowed 15. In most cases, like with Laserfiche Rio, it will have 1,000. There really isn't a limit in production environments as far as how many you can have. The recommended is to keep it as low as possible, though, because these repositories are fighting for resources on the server. So the more you have, the more resources that will be used, and then you'll start having conflicts with performance. So try to keep it as low as you can. Most people, especially smaller organizations, usually have one repository, but some of them will break it out as they get bigger by department or other needs, and you have the ability to create multiple. Next, let's go ahead and create the repository. On the left-hand side, I'm going to click Repositories. I'm then going to right-click and click Create New Repository. You can also click the Create New Repository up on the toolbar if you want to, and it'll take you to the same place. This opens the Laserfiche Repository Creation Wizard. It gives you a little bit of information up front, letting you know that it's going to establish the schema. You can attach a new repository to an instance of the Laserfiche server, and it will create the initial template and volume information for you. We'll click Next. We then select the Laserfiche server. It auto-populates that for us. You can connect the Laserfiche admin console to more than one Laserfiche server. I personally recommend only connecting to one server. It can get really confusing if you're not paying attention to which one you're connected to, especially production versus a test environment. I would recommend only connecting your admin console for production to production environments and then your test to test environments. Otherwise, you may be changing the wrong thing in production or vice versa. So we'll leave our Laserfiche server selected the way it is. We are then going to use Microsoft SQL Server. Click Next. And here we can give our repository a name. So in the previous steps when we created the database in Management Studio, that was just the database name. That is not the repository name. When you create your repository name, the repository name can contain letters, numbers, characters such as Chinese characters, and some symbols, but you can't have it contain any spaces. So in my case, I'm just going to name mine Fishbait. And then we need to select a repository path. So for a repository path, it needs to be a location on the computer that's hosting the Laserfiche server. So if you would like to have a different drive to put the repository on, I recommend that. That way it's not fighting for resources with the operating system. In my case, this is a demo environment, so I'm going to put it on the C drive. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm just going to name it Laserfiche Repositories. And then I will create one more folder named Fishbait. And now if we go back to the creation wizard, I can see my folder, my Fishbait folder, and I will click OK. Next we have the volume settings. The volumes are where the images, electronic files, and stuff like that are stored for the Laserfiche repository. The first thing that you select is the volume name. By default, it is named default. I have seen organizations change this to the organization's name. I've seen them use it based on the department of whose files will be in there. The best thing is to come up with a standard and make sure you stick with that. So you can create multiple volumes after the repository is created. But think all that through before you kind of go through and change the name. I would recommend just leaving it as default if you still need to think that through. And that way the volume in the repository will get created, and then you can go back later and create additional volumes if you need to. By default, the location for the repository files or the volume files is going to be the same as the Laserfiche files directory. So the repository path up here. So it will just create a subfolder, in this case underneath the Fishbait folder, for the default volume, and it will store everything there. You can actually go through and select a different location for that. So again, you could have another drive on the server where you could store that information, and you could set that separately. So one of the other locations that you could use is a UNC path. So it's going to be a location other than a drive on the Laserfiche server. Make sure you do specify a UNC path to the folder for the volume to be located in. The next thing that you can specify is the audit path settings. So again, there is a default setting, which is putting it underneath the repository path. But you can go through and use customized settings to change where that would be. So again, if you wanted that to be a different directory on a different drive, you could go through and specify that. Most of the time, these settings, unless you're a larger organization with multiple Laserfiche servers, these settings are set to the default. So the location for the volume is usually under the Laserfiche files directory, and the audit path settings are set to default settings. So we'll leave our settings there. I'm going to click next. The next part is where we specify the SQL server that we are going to connect to. So I will type in fichebait-serve. And if we were going to use the SQL Server authentication, again, we would come in here and put that in. I referenced that earlier. In our case, we're going to use Windows authentication. This is going to use the account that the Laserfiche server service is running as. So if I go into services, my Laserfiche server service is running as my utility Laserfiche account. So that's what's going to be accessing the SQL Server database. And that's why we went through those first steps of making sure that that account had permissions to the database we created. So now I'll go ahead and click the database dropdown. And here we can see the SQL database that we created earlier in SQL Server Management Studio. I'll go ahead and select that. If we didn't create the empty database previously, and we want the repository creation wizard to create it for us, we could actually free type the database name into this field as well, and then the creation wizard will create that for us when it runs. We'll go ahead and click next. Next, we can specify the search engine settings. So this is the full text search engine. So the search catalog and everything runs off of this. Again, most of the time you're going to use the default settings. It will create a folder for the catalog underneath the repository folder. So you can see down here, it'll create it underneath Fichebait in this case. If you have a larger system, your search engine may be on a different server. So your LFFTS may be installed somewhere else. So you can customize those settings and tell it where the search engine host is located at and what the catalog path for that would be. In this case, we're going to leave it as default. We'll click next. And then we can do a quick review of everything that we've set in the wizard, verify that everything looks okay. Something to check before you run this is if you go to your Laserfiche repository folder, where the repository folder will be located at, you'll want to make sure that the account that is running the Laserfiche server service has full control over that folder so it can create the files and the folders necessary for the repository. So now that we've verified that, we will go ahead and click next. We can see it. Once it's complete running the wizard, it will let you know that it was able to complete successfully. And if we go into SQL Server, we can see our repository database. And if we expand tables, we can see that all the tables have been created for us that the Laserfiche repository needs. If we go back to the Laserfiche administration console, we can now see with the repository selected on the left, our repositories available. By default, the username is admin with no password. So the first thing that you should do at this point is set a password for that admin account, and then you can continue going on with configuring the rest of your repository. And if we go into our Laserfiche repository folder, we can go into the Fichebait folder now, and we can see that our folder structures have been created as well. So here's where the audit logs will be stored, our default volume, different log files, our search catalog, and a temp folder. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, make sure you give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, keep fishing.